Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Come on in if you're in the back. We've got lots of spots down in the front. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here, and thank you for coming inside this morning. I know it's not easy on such a beautiful New England fall day. It's really showing off for Parents' Weekend, or Family Weekend. My name is Bathsheba Demuth, and I'm a professor here and also in the history department. And I'm also a Brown alumni, so I have memories of how busy Family Weekend is and how much you're running around and everyone's trying to find a place for breakfast. So I extra appreciate you joining us this morning at the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society, which has just turned 10 years old. We've been in this building now for a decade. And in those years, IBIS has become a kind of key hub on campus and beyond campus for people who are thinking hard about the environment around us and how we can live well with it, from the hills of Bangladesh to the air in downtown Providence to how ships make their way through the Arctic Ocean. So when I say that I'm lucky to have come back to Brown to work with these amazing colleagues, it's a real understatement. And today you're lucky enough to get a real sense of why I'm so lucky to be back here from my colleague, Dr. Myles Lennon. And he's going to speak with us for about 40 minutes. And then I'll moderate a short Q&A afterward. But like me, Dr. Lennon is also a Brown alumni from the class of 2006. I'm pretty sure we took a senior seminar together. He remembers some really awkward glasses that I wore back in the day. And Dr. Lennon, before doing his PhD at Yale in environmental anthropology, worked in the sustainable energy field. So what he's talking about with us today comes from both the perspective of a practitioner and somebody who has been thinking about it through the lens of anthropology now for years. He came back to join the faculty here at Brown in 2019 and is currently the dean's assistant, but soon to be associate professor of anthropology and environment and society. And I value many things about Dr. Lennon's work and what he brings to us here at IBIS. And I could spend this entire hour talking to you about how beloved he is as a professor among our students. And as parents of Brown students, you know that we teach folks with very high standards for their education and deeply involved in making choices about it. So when you are a beloved professor here, it is particularly meaningful. And I hear students call Dr. Lennon's classes life-changing, and they mean it. As one of our mutual advisees told me once, Dr. Lennon cares about you not just as a student in his class, but as a person. I could also go on about Dr. Lennon's writing, which I teach in several of my own courses here, but will instead exhort you, because I get to do this as the introducing person, to stop by the Brown bookstore and buy his first book, which is also the subject of his talk today, and is called Subjects of the Sun: Solar Energy in the Shadows of Racial Capitalism. This book, as we will hear shortly, exemplifies something that I personally value so much in Dr. Lennon's work and his presence at IBIS. Even in the face of environmental and political challenges that face us, challenges that in 2025 seem only to deepen with every storm and every press conference, Dr. Lennon asks us to aspire to be better, to not surrender our capacity for critical thought in the midst of crisis, and to remind us that we can aspire to more than simply to continue with the status quo. And in particular, Dr. Lennon reminds us to never forget that environments without justice, environments where only some people can live in health and peace, can never truly sustain us. Welcome, Dr. Lennon.
Wow, that was quite an introduction. I have so much to say, so I'm just gonna jump right in, but I appreciate you all being here and IBIS for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about my new book, Subjects of the Sun: Solar Energy in the Shadows of Racial Capitalism. And today I actually want to talk about a utopic vision synthesized in this often reproduced image, a photo that choreographs a future in which working class Black men lead the clean energy transition in communities that are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. This image is quite often used to illustrate the idea that we can deploy solar in a way that ushers in an economy that overturns the race and class inequalities endemic to fossil-fueled racial capitalism. But this very inspiring vision overlooks the myriad ways in which solar is in fact contingent on fossil-fueled racial capitalism. Solar technology is made from toxic materials like cadmium extracted from the earth, very often manufactured by essentially enslaved indigenous people in coal-powered factories in Western China, while children in the DRC mine the cobalt for its battery storage technologies. It's transported transnationally with fossil-fueled ships. It's often installed by exploited workers, and it could become a significant e-waste problem in marginalized communities throughout the world. So when this image is mobilized to support the narrative that poor people of color can counter their structural oppression vis-a-vis solar, it tells an incomplete story, and in many regards, a misleading story. The point here is not that solar is good or bad, but rather that renewable energy can simultaneously redress and re-entrench unjust fossil-fueled structures of power. Today, I want to suggest that so many of us overlook this complexity, imagining solar as an unproblematic force of climate justice, partly because we often experience the hard physical infrastructure of solar in the two-dimensional world of our screens through images like this. I conducted several years of ethnographic research on the solar installation companies, experts, and activists who are leading the renewable energy transition in New York City. And I found that so much of the work to protect life on Earth happens through life in the cloud. That renewable energy is as virtual as it is real, and that most of us who champion solar-powered climate justice don't touch, smell, hear, or have any direct sensory relationship with solar electricity outside of digital graphics and screen-based platforms. Today, specifically, I'm going to argue that the material properties of solar infrastructure, its shiny surfaces, decentralized spatiality, and quantifiable currents, interact with our virtual and visual media, Google Earth, spreadsheets, and PowerPoint, in ways that generate the common yet contradictory sense that solar is capable of paradoxically undoing the very structures of power that bring it into being. Now, that was a mouthful, so let me repeat that. Today, I'm going to focus on three material properties of solar: its shiny surfaces, its decentralized spatiality, and its quantifiable currents, and three forms of visual media: PowerPoint, Google Earth, spreadsheets, to show how solar interacts with screen work in ways that suggest that it is capable of paradoxically undoing the extraction and exploitation that bring it into being. This suggests that ushering in a just energy transition is not simply a matter of policy, innovations, or finance. It's also a matter of transforming how we relate to infrastructures that we usually only encounter on screens. And while much of my research was done prior to 2025, in an era of digitalized misinformation, it's crucial that we look at the mystifying power of screens, even in ostensibly benign spaces like a neighborhood solar campaign. So let's start with the screen. A screen just like this, broadcasting this familiar image on a PowerPoint cover slide in a classroom at a workforce training institute in Queens, New York. The classroom was packed with local activists who wanted to usher in a just energy transition in their communities. They had come for a tutorial on the nuts and bolts of solar led by an environmental justice organization and a solar expert. Given the political commitments of everyone in the room, the PowerPoint's cover slide didn't surprise me one bit. But what surprised me was the next slide, an image that resembled this one right here, an idyllic rendering of a pastoral farm that couldn't be further from the congested treeless streets where the classroom was actually located, in a city. So why would a presentation focus on solarizing a cosmopolitan megacity present solar in an idyllic grassy field without a person in sight? Now, there's an obvious reason why one might visually affiliate solar with the environment. It reduces carbon emissions and pollution, so it's long been thought of as a climate solution. Yet in this image, the panels appear not as a mitigation device to forestall humanity's impacts on an already degraded environment, but rather as a part of a pristine pasture, totally divorced from modern life. The absence of buildings, concrete, and humans here is significant because it suggests that solar is a part of a natural ecosystem, not an anthropogenic commodity, as though the panels sprouted organically from the grassy plain, obfuscating the exploitative relations that make solar panels possible: silicon extraction, coal-powered factories, the dumping of silicon tetrachloride, fossil fuel supply chains, and the Uyghurs who actually produce these panels. All of this is erased when we see solar as the natural offspring of the land. So, this underscores the question: why would activists fighting for solar in the city naturalize it through appeals to the pastoral? And why would environmental justice activists desituate an industrial commodity from its extractive means of production? In response, I want to suggest that sunshine shapes the political imaginary of solar, impelling modern urban subjects to see it as an organic force of life and not a commodity made in dirty factories. To break this down, let's look closely at the way this image visualizes a shiny flash of light generated by the sun. Literary theorist Anne Chung theorizes the power of this visual effect when she explains, shine offers less a description or quality of light than an active mode of relationality, a dynamic medium through which the organic and the inorganic fuse. And we can identify this active mode of relationality at the point in these images where the sun's rays intersect with a flat anthropogenic surface, the solar panel. This shiny intersection evinces the sort of organic-inorganic fusion that Cheng describes, a biospheric phenomenon the sun conjoined with a manufactured energy technology. So the visual simulation of the panel's shine attempts to endow an electricity commodity with the feel of a natural process, the organic liveliness attributed to the sun's rays. The shine is thus contiguous with other facets of this image that naturalize solar, such as the grassy field without a human in sight, the only trace of humanity being this small house in the backdrop, suggesting a simpler time when social life didn't upset nature's rhythms. Following Chung, I suggest that it makes sense that activists in New York City would affiliate shininess with the non-human world that this image aestheticizes because of the ways that modern urbanites actually experience shininess in our day-to-day lives. Consider Manhattanhenge, an annual event in which New Yorkers gawk at the sunset on the days when it's optimally aligned with Manhattan's street grid, seeking out the vitality of the cosmos, life beyond the human, when the city skyline glistens. Similarly, numerous city dwellers watch the city skyscrapers with fascination when the towers are kissed by the sun during its descent, engrossed with their environment as the yellow orb in the sky makes their buildings shine. You see, the fusion of industrial glass surfaces and the sun's rays creates a particular affective experience that the PowerPoint images aestheticize. Sean, one of my interlocutors, described this experience while staring at the sun as it hit the lower Manhattan skyline. He said, "This is a place where you could look up and know that life exists. I don't know what's so enlivening about it." He shook his head with a loss of words. It just literally is enlivening. Sean here speaks to a sublime liveliness that inheres in modern infrastructure, understood as the antithesis of natural life, as the sun infuses this infrastructure with a non-human presence, disrupting an anthropocentric conception of the built environment. The PowerPoint images aestheticize this sort of affective encounter with sun-kissed industrialized surfaces, attempting to visualize the conjoining of timeless nature and modern man's machines, that which punctuates everyday life beneath the city skyline, as Sean suggests. Indeed, in a settler colony built on the Lenape people's homeland, it makes sense that one would affiliate the non-human vitality of shiny skyscrapers with the ostensible purity of a grassy field, because this sort of grassy field harkens to a genre of nature visuals that idealize pristine landscapes that were in fact caused by indigenous genocide. These nature visuals uphold an imaginary of a pure non-human environment, erasing the land's indigenous stewards. In this way, this image locates shiny solar in what William Cronin calls the domesticated sublime. Man-made landscapes that misleadingly look like an awesome non-human nature, as the sun invites our awe by blurring boundaries between the built environment and more than human life. Now, this tendency to see anthropogenic objects as having a life of their own, independent of human production, anthropogenic items appearing as though they are independent of human production. What is this called? You want to say a little louder? Commodity fetishism. That's right. This is known as commodity fetishism. And theorists of commodity fetishism say that capital enables us to see the commodities that humans produce as autonomous, non-human forms of life. But I'm suggesting that the sunshine, not just capital, endows a solar commodity with a life of its own, complicating traditional theories of commodity fetishism like those of Erich Fromm, who suggested that commodities alienate us or separate us from nature. In these images, commodities are fetishized on the grounds that they could actually overcome such alienation. So while solar panels and iPhones are made under comparable conditions with many of the same industrial materials, the sun enables us to see one of these as more natural than the other, to see solar as not merely a life force independent of its production, but also a sublime presence that ameliorates the structural conditions of its production. Yet sunshine is only one piece of the equation here. The medium of PowerPoint is also key, because most New Yorkers don't encounter shiny solar panels in their day-to-day lives. As a technology nestled on multi-story building rooftops that you can't see from the street, a technology that generates no sound, no smell, while also generating streams of charged electrons that can't be detected by the human eye, solar is not something that most of us have any direct sensory relationship with. And in a society of the spectacle, organized around the primacy of sight, digital media is the central way many of us encounter, understand, and relate to the world around us, such that visuals constitute a privileged site for modern subjects to apprehend energy infrastructures that are usually hidden from plain sight and that produce ubiquitous electrical charges that are as powerful as they are invisible. So efforts to get everyday people to support a technology that they'll likely never touch or use in any conventional everyday way demand visual representation in our ocular-centric society. And perhaps no media is better suited to this than PowerPoint, a platform intended to make complex ideas palatable, to render accessible something that is otherwise outside of one's grasp. So while the sun endows an anthropogenic commodity with an air of nature that feels antithetical to anthropogenic commodities, this naturalistic affect relies upon a palatable visual form to make it apprehensible, to distill its general vibe, but with an air of authority. Conditions right, of course, for a PowerPoint. Even so, it was not a given that grassroots activists would choose a white-collar medium to tap into a naturalistic imaginary of solar. The choice of PowerPoint bespoke other ideological transformations that solar accelerated, transformations that I began to better understand in a more traditionally technocratic setting, a very sterile office, when I peered at the screen of Celeste, a white solar professional. On Celeste's screen, I saw a Google Earth rendering of roofs in a working-class Black community that she was planning a solar installation for. Lacking in green space, the scene in this view illustrates how concrete and man-made surfaces dominate marginalized urban areas, a metonym of environmental injustice, because poor Black and brown communities are home to a greater share of treeless spaces, which in turn gives form to inequities related to flooding, air quality, urban heat island, and food access. Yet my thoughts went to the concrete not when I first viewed Celeste's screen, but rather when she said that very word, concrete. The concrete she spoke of, though, didn't refer to the paved streets on her screen. Instead, she was talking about the paradoxically tangible qualities of her virtual labor, the ways in which her work on a screen felt more real, more impactful, more concrete than her previous policy advocacy work. I chose solar because it feels like a more concrete, positive thing that you can achieve for the low-income communities of color I used to organize, she said, contrasting her present technocratic work coordinating the early stages of a solar installation with her previous, more idealistic career leading affordable healthcare campaigns. Yet this concrete work occurred not through a medium that she could actually touch, but instead a cloud-based platform that solely apprehends the built environment through a pixelated aerial view, as she sat in an open office layout nowhere near the truly concrete spaces that she aimed to touch. Her employer, a solar technical assistance provider, works with installation contractors to do this sort of upfront work for solar installations, focusing primarily on marginalized communities. As Celeste and I were talking, she was conducting a preliminary site analysis of rooftops to identify if these rooftops could successfully be solarized. And crucially, if Celeste were addressing any old building, I'm not clear that she would call her Google Earth work concrete. But she was specifically simulating solar arrays for a giant, affordable housing cooperative in a community of color. Solar arrays that, she explained, could yield immediate term savings for people burdened by high energy bills, protecting a demographic that's vulnerable to rampant gentrification in New York City. These savings, their clear impact on poor people's lives in the here and now, rendered her screen work concrete in her analysis. Concrete in contrast to idealistic social justice policy. Even so, without knowing the community she was indirectly engaging with through her screen, how could she be so sure that this two-dimensional solar arrays that she affixed to virtual rooftops with a mouse truly catalyzed concrete change? Given the preponderance of actual concrete in the community she viewed from a distance, and the environmental injustices that these impermeable surfaces point to, from where did she get this sense that her screen work was the best way to address the community's concrete problems? The answer here largely lies in solar's decentralized topography. Whereas fossil fuel energy is generated in power plants and then distributed to buildings through a centralized network of substations, solar electricity generation is far more diffuse, occurring on the rooftops of people's everyday spaces, their homes, community centers, and schools. This diffuse spatiality decentralizes energy production, enabling individual homeowners, residential cooperatives, commercial property owners, and community organizations to govern the electrical power that they previously could only purchase. But this more democratic form of energy governance is just as reliant on technocratic corporations as centralized energy generation, requiring advanced design, contracting, permitting, financing, and grid interconnection services. As a result, solar creates new opportunities for white-collar energy professionals to work with low-income communities of color that they otherwise have no relationship with. This, in turn, transforms the ideological landscape of energy management, as Celeste illustrates. Because Celeste, you might not think, is actually a self-identified Marxist, ecofeminist, and intersectional activist. That's not really her, that's just a stock photo, but that's what she looks like. But she's not so naive to think that her solar screen work is a transformative change that she desires. Instead, the technical assistance that she provides to building owners is intended to support a market-based approach to the energy transition, as it entails doing analytical work that enables solar companies to sign customer contracts, in contradistinction to a public sector approach to energy transitions that regards solar as a public good or an entitlement. In this way, her company upholds a market-based form of governance that she, not me, she pejoratively labels neoliberalism. You might have heard this word if you go to Brown University, neoliberalism. A form of racial capitalism that she, not me, she explicitly opposes, enabling energy transition centered on consumer markets as opposed to public ownership. I don't necessarily see revolution to be part of our mission, she said, pointing indicatively at the word Google on her screen. But her anti-capitalist ethos does not, in her mind, preclude the possibility that capitalized solar can challenge a system in which marginalized communities pay a disproportionate share of their income on energy while shouldering a disproportionate share of its environmental burdens. By enabling her to work in such communities, the screen is the medium through which Celeste addresses this energy inequality. Her eyes glued to Google Earth, she identifies rooftops in low-income communities of color with potential for solar, efficiently navigating the city's skyline without ever leaving her desk. In the process, she attempts to steer private solar contractors and solar investments to the most marginalized communities. Thus, solar's diffuse spatiality aligns with a cloud-based panopticism to foster an ideologically muddled approach to technocratic care, affectively cross-pollinating socialist and anti-racist principles with the techno-scientific ideology of clean tech corporations. This, in turn, dilutes the normative ideological poles that traditionally divide these different orientations, as the technocrat and the activists, the neoliberal and the anti-capitalist coalesce through the screenwork of infrastructural transformation. Celeste exemplifies this boundary blurring subjectivity, which I like to conceptualize as the equicrat, short for the equity-minded technocrat, a liberal subject who reflexively mobilizes their technocratic training towards social equity. Thus, the decentralization of energy counterintuitively powers what we can think of as the centralization of ideology, an erosion of the phantasmatic lines separating conflicting political visions, such as free markets versus eco-socialism. It is precisely this potential to equitably decentralize energy governance through screen work, to solarize communities that fossil capital traditionally neglects, that draws Celeste to an office job that she would otherwise reject. This suggests that Google Earth represents a break in the way that the technocratic gaze operates as a mode of governance. In contrast to the high modern surveillance that comprise the centralized power of 20th century statecraft, Celeste and other equicrats remotely survey space in support of a decentralized regime of power to redress racial inequality, reappropriating the technocratic gaze towards social justice. Now, I began to see the problems with this technocratic gaze when I left the office and volunteered for environmental justice organizations in the concrete spaces that Celeste solarized from afar. These organizations embraced what's known as the Solarize model for developing residential solar. And under the Solarize model, community groups launch local campaigns to organize community members into what's called a solar purchasing pool. And a purchasing pool is very simply a mechanism through which neighbors in a community collectively agree to purchase solar together from a single contractor, who in turn commits to reducing costs through economies of scale. The more homeowners who join the purchasing pool, the more leverage the community has in negotiating competitive solar prices. Makes sense, right? The Solarize model is what Celeste would call a neoliberal approach to energy transitions, because it enlists community members to market private corporations by leveraging their local relationships, inculcating everyday people into market-based energy governance, detracting from other grassroots work for climate policy. Yet Solarize campaigns are branded as grassroots efforts through which neighbors work collaboratively, hand in hand, to overcome structural barriers to renewable energy. The spatiality of residential solar, the fact that it relies on people's domestic spaces, lends itself to this localized consumer activism, as clusters of sun-exposed rooftops enable community-based organizations to imagine an inclusive clean energy economy in their own backyards. And in the process, these organizations prioritize consumer action over political organizing, transforming activists into equicrats, focus more on leveraging expertise to navigate the market than on transformative change. Now, this equicratic reorientation is exemplified by Janice, a 70-year-old retiree who was an active member of her community's environmental justice organization. As part of my research, I volunteered with the organization, which I'll simply call Equal. And Equal has a very long history of organizing against corporations and for robust government regulation. But the spatiality of residential solar shifted Equal's work towards much more market-based environmental activism, even as the organization continued to endorse government regulation, not markets. Specifically, Equal launched a Solarize campaign to tap into the solar potential of their community's rooftops. And Janice emerged as the community's most committed volunteer for this campaign. But when Equal solicited pricing proposals from solar contractors as part of their purchasing pool campaign, Janice began to perform an equicratic persona. These proposals provided information on how contractors would lower prices for differently sized purchasing pools. Equal convened its volunteers for a meeting to review the proposals to determine which contractor they would select. But before the meeting, I was in Equal's office when Janice started a very impassioned conversation with a few of the organization's interns on, quote, this is her words, the ways that capitalism is to blame for climate change. This is just as Janice's words. She repeatedly emphasized the importance of dismantling capitalism through the equitable deployment of renewable energy. But when the contractor meeting began, this critique of capitalism was nowhere to be found. Instead, Janice and 10 other community members resembled Celeste by immersing themselves in screen work, soberly scanning a spreadsheet on a smartboard with pricing metrics which costed out 6 contractor solarizing plans. During this scan, Janice practiced a technocratic managerialism that lacked her usual political fervor. Specifically, she instructed everyone in the room to look carefully at all of the contractor's data and to be as, quote, objective as possible when they rated the contractors on a scale from 1 to 5 with regard to the contractor's prices, experience, and proposal scopes. The community members followed these instructions, but they raised concerns that they wouldn't be as objective as possible because they're not experts and because not all contractors supply data in the same way, making it difficult to compare their data objectively. Now, I found this dogmatic focus on objectivity to be bizarre because as a mythic ideal, objectivity gestures to an assessment of the cold, hard facts, so to speak, and it therefore allegedly doesn't involve personal beliefs. So, in theory, there's no need to ask lay people who don't fully understand those cold, hard facts to do such an assessment. The whole point of centering lay people in grassroots campaigns is to engage with their personal beliefs, their subjective views. What's the use in recruiting lay people to evaluate something if you're asking them to withhold their personal beliefs? If Equal Solarize campaign was really going to be a community-driven effort, then I figured community members should have been empowered to evaluate the contractors based on the information that matters to them without any pretenses of objectivity. But when I articulated this, my objection to objectivity pissed Janice off. She countered by explaining that community members needed to have an objective analysis in order to effectively market their campaign's contracting services to their neighbors. Objectivity here gestures to a rational market actor capable of sorting through information and choosing a service based on transparent reason. Janice then was suggesting that only rational market actors could sell solar locally, thus For all of her anti-neoliberal, anti-capitalist politics, Janice called on her comrades to become a sort of homo economicus, the self-interested consumer in neoclassical economic theory who maximizes their own good through a, quote, objective analysis. This transformation occurred not because she believes in free markets, she doesn't, but in no small part because electricity is enmeshed in the quantitative metrics that her spreadsheet stylized. Specifically, the grid demands that we quantify the electricity that we inject into it and withdraw from it to ensure that energy is rapidly consumed when it's produced, because solar electricity cannot be stored, or any electricity cannot be stored in large quantities, unlike most other commodities. So, industrialized electricity literally cannot exist without being quantified, in contrast to, for instance, cars. Of course, it's necessary to numerically quantify most commodities. You cannot produce a car, right, without measurements of its dimensions, for instance. But if you shut down a manufacturing plant after it produces 12 cars without determining this quantity beforehand, the cars it produced still exist. By contrast, you cannot produce industrialized electricity without proactively quantifying it, as failure to do so would cause a blackout. And in a capitalist context, this proactive quantification occurs through prices, as grid equilibrium partly is achieved by creating a high price per kilowatt hour when electricity demand is high and a much lower price when demand is low. Electricity then is predisposed to the commodity form. Capital is largely inextricable from the grid. Thus, leftist aspirations for community solar are necessarily beholden to the commodity form, in contrast to similar aspirations for collective housing, for instance. Janice then had no choice but to conceptualize electricity as a market commodity, no matter her anti-capitalist aspirations. We can attribute this presence to not only the ways the grid is managed, but also how electricity prices operate in our everyday and her everyday sensory landscape. Prices are how most people know and engage with the electricity that they depend on, giving a legible form to streams of electrons that they otherwise can't see. Of course, we can see the effects of electricity, a bright light bulb, for instance, and many marginalized communities are directly exposed to power plant pollution, Freudian slip. But the actual currents that constitute electricity remain imperceptible to the eyes. Market metrics, though, overcome this invisibility. When lay people review, contemplate, pay, and contest their utility bills, prices enable them to engage with electricity generation processes that are largely hidden. Of course, other commodities prices are similarly, other commodities prices are similarly affective. We largely relate to our cars, for instance, through prices. Yet electricity prices are affective in ways that most other commodities prices could never be. Because most people, in the global north at least, who don't work in the electricity generation sector, have no sensorial relationship with the electrical currents that power our lives. And we don't think much about electricity itself, except in the context of utility bills. In fact, prices visualize electricity in ways that non-monetary quantification could not. If I say, I have 5 potatoes, most of us can pretty effortlessly conjure a mental image based on this statement, right? 5 potatoes. If I say, I have a 5 megawatt solar electricity system, few lay people could actually envision what this really looks like. So price is the primary mode through which lay persons conceive electricity as a distinct entity. And in the context of Equal Solarized campaign, the spreadsheet is a totem of price, giving it a material form, incorporating it in a world of community activism, enabling Janice to intervene in a realm of electrical power that she otherwise has no control over. This intervention entails comparing contractors' proposals through market metrics, impelling the spreadsheet's viewer to apprehend energy as a matter of rational calculation focused on aggregating market demand. Thus, the spreadsheet telegraphs an edict to economize rooted in an imperative to collectivize, enabling grassroots activists to lead a populist project through consumer activism, through commercial consumerism, rather. And this populist consumerism informed Janus's directive to perform an objective homo economicus. For the imagined subject here is less a rational market actor and more a rational market activist, utilizing competitive prices in ways that mobilize local people to press for change through private contracts. Solar's inherent compatibility with price impels anti-capitalist activists to adopt the reductive calculi that they disdain. By curating prices, the spreadsheet offers one such anti-capitalist, Janus, a practical tool to mobilize her community for solar. But this was troubling, because when the community members numerically rated the prospective contractors using a scoring rubric focused on market matters like price per watt and solar panel efficiency, they didn't at all consider community well-being, climate change, or local jobs. And unsurprisingly, when they tabulated the scores, the contractor who won the bid had incredibly low prices. But their bid had one major catch. They primarily employed volunteers to do the bulk of their installation work. So the contractor had extremely low prices because they literally did not pay their workers. This was legal because they're a nonprofit that bills their work as, quote, workforce training. And when it was clear that the company had objectively won a contract, I incredulously raised the matter of jobs and labor standards, hoping that this could disrupt this dogmatic focus on prices. Now, everyone in the room strongly agreed with me that we needed to focus on good jobs. But in another surprising twist, most community members said that they couldn't award the contract to another contractor because, one, they had all agreed on scoring parameters, and it would be unfair to change the parameters at this late stage. And two, solar is expensive, so low-income communities of color, like their own, need competitive solar rates. Now, in this second point here, we see no vision for an equitable public sector to counteract private capital. The spreadsheet's economistic logics dwarf Janus's eco-socialist aspirations. Similarly, the community's first point about fairness conveyed a sort of a sense of professional accountability toward private contractors, as though they were bureaucrats overseeing a public bidding process and not local activists with the prerogative to work with whomever they wanted to. Taken together, these two arguments point to an equocratic politics in grassroots spaces that have traditionally been defined in opposition to capitalism. And again, this equocratic politics emerges when the invisible streams of solar-powered electrons intersect with the economizing imperatives of the solarized spreadsheet. So the broader point here is that solar's material properties, its shiny surfaces, decentralized spatiality, and electrical flows to and from the grid interact with our virtual and visual media, PowerPoint, Google Earth, spreadsheets in ways that enable equity-minded solar advocates to reproduce the structures of power that we imagine that solar contests. So ushering in a just energy transition is not simply a matter of policy, technical innovations, or finance. It's also a matter of transforming how we interact with energy infrastructures that we usually only encounter on screens. When seen on the screen, energy is a lifeless force that humans can tabulate, control, and grow indefinitely, a vestige of the first industrial scale energy system, the transatlantic slave trade, which rendered energy in terms of lifeless units of power that could be extracted from black bodies and graphed on two-dimensional ledgers. Indeed, our two-dimensional orientation to energy has always upheld racial hierarchies by obfuscating the corporeal, physical relations that constitute life. So in closing, to truly transform these relations vis-a-vis solar, I look to BK Rot, a food waste hauling and compost nonprofit run by young people of color in Brooklyn. For a very small fee, BK Rot's workers haul food waste with solar-powered cargo trikes from businesses and homes to a community garden. They then use solar-powered mechanical sifters to convert this waste into compost, which they use to generate life in the garden and to sell beyond the garden. Revenues from solar-powered compost sales and waste hauling, combined with nonprofit funding, enable BK Rot to pay their youth workers a living wage for labor that's usually unpaid. Instead of trying to manage humans' impacts on the environment through a screen at a desk, solar power here enables humans to work with the non-human world, positioning the world as a part of an urban landscape. By tapping the power of the sun, their cargo trikes and mechanical sifters enhance the power of their workers' quads, glutes, hamstrings, hips, arms, and backs to pedal, haul, and transform organic waste throughout the city, combining physical labor and solar to generate reciprocal relations between humans and more than human life. As fossil fuels deprive poor communities of color of vegetation, robust soil ecosystems, and permeable surfaces, these communities require not simply new technology like solar panels, but rather a new approach to stewarding life. BK Rot offers one such approach, with solar technology as an aid, not a panacea. These young people live, breathe, bike, hold, touch, and haul a tangible alternative to petrol-powered waste, making physical spaces that safeguard against climate disasters. And in this spirit, I want to call by inviting you all to actually touch and actually physically engage with BK Rot's compost right here. I'm going to pass around this bowl and think about this as not just soil, but this is solar power right here. This is what solar power looks like when our bodies combine with the world that we exist in and we transform our relationship with energy. These are wonderful technologies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Myles. This is confirmation that I really do prefer my compost pile to a spreadsheet, which is very true. So I have a couple of questions on deck, but I also want to hear from y'all first. So if anybody has a question ready to go, we'd be happy to field them. There are microphones up here, which is helpful because this is being simulcasted. So if you walk up to the mic, then people can hear you online if they're streaming in. So if anyone's ready to go, head up to the mic.
And while you're ideating your brilliant question, I do have this bag of BK Rot compost soil. And if anybody wants it, first come, first serve, it is yours. So just let me know after and I will give you this bag.
All right, so yeah, come on up.
First of all, thank you so much. You made me think in ways that had never occurred to me to think before. So I appreciate that. I also know that, in talking to my son and the sort of his friends and their generation, they feel pretty disgusted with the potential of government to really do something good. Mm-hmm. A, and they also B, feel a deep sense of urgency about doing something about carbon dioxide levels fast. And so they feel prepared to make some compromises in order to get this thing done fast. Quickly. Because, the deadline is approaching.
Totally.
And so while I love the example you gave me of the compost, and I do in fact compost myself, there is a part of me that feels like, your pictures of the Uyghurs and the kids who are, it's just heart-wrenching. But there is another part of me that thinks, yeah, but we just have to do everything we can, even though it's imperfect, which it clearly is, highly imperfect. But I would love to hear your response to that sense of urgency about do everything we can as fast as possible.
Totally. I really appreciate that question. We're dealing with a global climate crisis, and I'm telling you to compost in your neighborhood. It doesn't seem like an appropriate response. But I think that, in fact, I think that spirit of needing to do many things at once, I think that that's certainly a spirit that I endorse. And that if we want to move beyond a panacea vision of change that says we need to just do this one magical thing, deploy solar at this scale, get this number of terawatts of renewable energy power, and then we'll be good. If we want to move beyond that, we need to be doing lots of things. And that does entail large-scale infrastructural transformations with these very flawed technologies deployed in sometimes imperfect ways that can meaningfully reduce our carbon footprint. So I don't want to, I'm not at all belittling the importance of large-scale policy-based work, for instance. However, that work alone
for so many reasons will not save us, right? And this idea of urgent, while there is urgency, I don't think we need to think of urgency strictly in terms of a carbon budget and these very arbitrary deadlines that we set. Remember, first we had to decarbonize by 2020. Now then they moved it to 2030. Now they moved to 2050. And when I say they, I'm talking about the sort of arbitrary timelines that we see in these climate reports that are generated by political actors that go to the IPCC and say, we want to see a report that models what it would look like if we got to net zero by 2050, for instance. There's not a, quote, objective science that says 2050 is the deadline date or else we're all toast, right? It's a little more complicated than that when we look at the workings of the climate system. So our task is to really think about what is the future that we want for ourselves, right? The future that we want for ourselves is not lower carbon. We want to be able to live in environments that are clean. We want to be able to support ourselves. We want to be able to have family. We want to be able to care for the other forms of life that we depend upon, not low carbon by 2050. Low carbon by 2050 is one way of getting there. And so I think it's really incumbent on us to look at multiple strategies and to recognize that if we really want to get at the root of these problems, many of these strategies to decarbonize are actually contingent on things that reproduce these problems. So in addition to doing the large-scale decarbonization work, we need to completely fundamentally redefine our orientation to our environments, the ways that we steward and care for the sacred life that upholds our own lives on this planet. And when we approach environmental stewardship in that holistic way, I think it really requires not simply looking at urgent budgets, but also in the here and now, what are we doing to redefine our relationship with the world around us? And there's so much more I can say. I'll leave it at that, but I'd be happy to talk to you more about specifics with regard to urgency, because I can relate. I'll just say one final thing. The reason why I'm here, guys, I used to do energy policy. I had that same idea. I was like, look, I was like Celeste. I was like, we need to do concrete things. We don't have time for this. And I worked in New York. We passed what was then the most ambitious climate policy in 2010. And it had equity provisions in it, and it had funding behind it. It was remarkable. And you know what? It did almost nothing. It was supposed to get to 1 million energy efficient retrofits in 5 years. It got to 23,000. And that's because the way that change actually operates does not actually align with these kind of clean models that we have, right? And so it's important for us to look skeptically at these utopic models and to really deal with the environment that we have in the here and now. And I'll just leave it at that. Sorry.
Thank you. Anyone else? I actually have a kind of related question. I've been thinking about the ways in which so much of our experience of climate change, if you don't live in a frontline community, if you maybe don't live very close to obvious impacts, is actually kind of scripted for us through models. It comes through screens.
Totally.
And I'm wondering about how you see that impacting our kind of political capacities to understand, in some ways, the urgency, but also what's at stake. And what happens, not that the models are bad, right? We need them, they're important. They're kind of fundamental to being able to do kinds of planning and hopefully political change, that it's important. But it also struck me that so much of what I know about climate change really comes through a version of a spreadsheet, essentially.
Totally. I mean, the climate change, I think, is really unlike any other environmental problem, because the way that tending to climate change is unlike any other form of environmental stewardship, because most environmental stewardship entails some level of interaction with some proximity to the environmental problem and some interaction with it, right? So if you have a dirty facility in your backyard, you see the plumes of smoke, you can breathe the toxins, right? There's a proximity there to many environmental injustices that require that we internalize and take on the problem, because we're literally breathing it. But when we look at these abstract global circulation models or general circulation models, we don't see, it's hard for us to envision how these models actually impact our very well-being and our day-to-day lives. And even if we look at storm surge and realize, oh shit, I'm in a storm surge in 2030, my house could be underwater. We see it. It's hard to internalize it on a beautiful day like this. You hear the birds chirping. And so that disconnect to me really underscores the necessity of localizing climate action, making it real, and connecting climate impacts to the very on-the-ground, everyday realities that we have, and not being so dependent on screen work to choreograph what we need to be doing.
We probably have time for one more question.
I got one. Thank you for that connection between the iPhone and the solar panel. I think that's actually genius because we have so much built-in awareness of certain kinds of labor, but not other kinds. So I really appreciated that. I live in rural Maine where the dimensions of the problem are sometimes really different, where it's not, and I was very struck by the argument for the activist going back into their community where they had to sell it based on economic benefits, because that's not real in many rural communities. And so I guess my question sort of to some extent is how much of your model or approach connects with rural communities, where in rural communities, it's as much about reliability, it's as much about alienation from control. So yeah.
Sir, and which facets of community solar don't feel applicable to rural communities?
So the point about the way in which electricity is essentially invisible to most of us until we pay a bill, true. In rural communities, particularly farming and fishing related, electricity is it is part of the economic tapestry. If I'm a lobsterman and I have bait and the cooler goes out and the bait dies, I'm in big trouble.
Totally.
And so there's an economic piece to that, but it's not
totally
just the numbers on the bill. And there is a huge thing within some rural communities, which is we are going to resist the man, whoever, and the man is central being power in our, centralized utility. So there is some social, there are other social factors involved.
So that's a really important point. And I'd say, even in urban spaces, we all have a relationship to electricity that's not just mediated through screens and through our energy bills. The point that I was making, though, was that if there's a fisherman that experiences any kind of electrical disruption, that disruption becomes very pertinent and then it becomes front of mind. And that's why, I did focus on global north areas because there are parts of global south where tending to electricity is part of just everyday life. But while that being the case, and all of us have a relationship to electricity to some extent, what I was really focusing on was the way that we think about these invisible streams of charged electrons, right? The way that we actually have any kind of visual orientation to, and the way that we address the amount of charged electrons, right? That are powering our everyday lives every day. Those things don't become front and center in our mind unless we're actually converting them into a figure on our energy bill. And I would reckon that in many rural places that is the case as well. So if you're talking about spaces where there is frequent disruption, when there's not regular power, then absolutely it becomes front in mind and central in ways that it's not in a place like New York City, where while there's an occasional blackout, we tend to have reliable electricity. And in terms of fighting the utilities, that goes hand in hand, though, with our relationship with electricity as a monetized commodity, because investor-owned utilities control the power we depend on for a profit, and that rightfully pisses a lot of people off. So, but I would say that kind of organizing you refer to is still emblematic of how we relate to electricity, primarily through our energy bills.
Thank you all so much for coming. If you want to keep in touch with IBIS, there is information about how to do so out on the table out front. And we will hang around and answer any questions before you head off to do other amazing things today.
If anybody wants some solar power,